G'day, my name's Chris Anderson and I'm the Varroa Mite Response Coordinator for New South Wales DPI, and I'd like to give you a little bit of a rundown on the Varroa destructor eradication program in New South Wales, including a little bit of history, a little bit around the decision-making process, and some information around the next steps. And please forgive me if I sound like I have a frog in my throat. I'm just recovering from COVID. So what you can see here are the very first two ever Varroa destructor mites that had been seen down a dissection microscope collected from hives on the Australian mainland. And this was the first evidence that we had of a problem, and that was around about 11 a.m. on Wednesday, June 22. So the Varroa destructor eradication campaign obviously started with the detection of those two mites which had been collected off a sticky mat from these two sentinel hives here at Newcastle, which you can see. Now those two hives are part of a larger national bee pest surveillance program which operates in all jurisdictions in Australia, and I suppose this was a great example of that program actually working really effectively. At that point in time, we thought that these were the first hives to become infested, and their proximity to the Port of Newcastle was, I suppose, painting a picture that maybe what we were dealing with here was a swarm that had come off a ship, and that's what we'd expect to see. So before I launch into what happened next, I just want to give you a bit of background on the Australian Biosecurity Committee structure. And so we have, under a biosecurity response in Australia, we have a system where the jurisdictions are the combat agencies. So in New South Wales, it's the Department of Primary Industries. In Queensland, it's DAF, the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries. And then in Victoria and in Tasmania and the other states, it's their state agriculture department who leads the biosecurity responses. Sitting above us at the national level is something called the Consultative Committee on Emergency Plant Pests, or the CCEPP, which is the committee of, or the National Committee of Technical Experts, the people that make technical decisions about is it feasible to eradicate, and is it cost beneficial to eradicate. And that committee then in turn makes a recommendation to what's known as the National Management Group, or the NMG, and these are the decision makers. These are the people who take that technical advice and then make resource decisions and commit funds to action those decisions. So they're the heads of department and industry leaders across the country. So administratively, when we first saw those two mites down the microscope, we had to immediately notify the federal government. We had to notify the Consultative Committee on Emergency Plant Pests, so the CCEPP. The CCEPP then needed to agree that it is an emergency pest, which triggers what is known as the Emergency Plant Pest Response Deed. That decision triggers that deed, which is a deed of agreement between industry and government parties in Australia to cost share responses to these pests. And then a response plan needed to be developed and approved for implementation by the National Management Group, the NMG. So at that point in time, on Wednesday the 22nd, we had two IPs that were essentially at the same location at the Port of Newcastle. So that was two premises, I guess you would describe them, that were at or on the Port of Newcastle, where we had found Varroa mites in hives. And this is what the picture looked like. By Friday, July the 8th, So a few weeks later, we had around 30 detections, and so those red 10-kilometre circles were up to about 30, and the area around Newcastle was now starting to look a bit more like a blob. And this was the day where we presented our response plan to the National Management Group, and they approved it. So this was a response plan for the first 100 days, and the aim was to eradicate known infestations and to limit the extent of the spread, whilst always looking to minimise the impacts on business continuity for the bee industry and for pollination-dependent industries. This obviously triggered a massive collaborative effort, and here are some images of Rural Fire Service staff and volunteers at the State Coordination Centre in Orange, and just some action shots inside the SCC. These are some of the laboratory technicians who are at the Orange Ag Institute who are looking down the microscope at sticky mats and examining samples for the presence of Varroa. And then obviously the field effort that ramped up was beyond anything that we've ever had to put in place. And many of you who are watching this now were a big part of that field effort. These are some images of the work going on in the field, and also the wrapping of hives for disposal that had been done by a lot of the field teams. A huge, monumental collaborative effort across a whole range of agencies, and not just the DPI. So a little bit about surveillance and tracing. So as you saw, we quickly grew from 1 infected premises to around about 30, and then through a process of tracing, investigation and tracing, and follow-up surveillance on that information, we were able to determine the actual spread of the mite, and that was done through essentially identifying the forward and the reverse traces from each infected premises, and then visiting all of those sites and physically doing the inspections and the surveillance to determine whether there was further infestation either at those forward or reverse traces. And this is just an example of one of the maps that shows the complexity of what was undertaken. On top of that, the surveillance, the hive movement surveillance that was largely done by the industry and then has been verified and followed up through sticky mat surveillance by the response team. And then on the right hand, the response surveillance here, which shows a combination of surveillance by response as well as volunteer and surveillance submissions from the general public, a lot of that through amateur beekeepers. So the area that you can see down the bottom here is largely amateur beekeeper submissions through the Sydney Basin. And in total, it's a little bit higher than this now, but we've surveyed over 28,000 hives, and industry surveillance, it's actually well more than 200,000 hives that have been surveyed by industry. And all of this has amounted to around about 100 detections. So 0.04% of the hives that have been looked at have actually been shown to have signs of Varroa. And on top of that, we've had the vast majority of those being around the Newcastle area and close to the port, close to the Williamtown or the Newcastle airport area. It's mostly concentrated in that part of the world. The red zones in total add up to around about 5,234 square kilometres. Within that area, we've now euthanized around about 65% of the hives that were present, the managed beehives, and we're working through that relatively quickly and hope to have that finished within the next sort of 4 to 6 weeks. And I mean, the real thing to point out here is the 1,746 people who have been involved from across at least 13 agencies. And this, based on our epidemiological work, gives us around about a 99.99% confidence that Varroa is delimited to those red areas. The next highest risk areas are the purple areas around the red areas, and then the rest of New South Wales being the blue zone. So what happens next? Well, what has already started is the wild bee baiting program. And as you can see here, these are fairly simple contraptions that we put together. They contain, for the vast majority of time, just pure sugar syrup and nothing else. And then there is a baiting cycle that is adhered to where those stations, the sugar syrup is removed and they're spiked with a syrup solution that contains fipronil. That's left there for a few hours and then removed, and the sugar is then replaced back into those stations. And as you can see here, the stations are very effective. This was the first day of baiting with fipronil. I believe this one was in the Jerry's Plains area, and this is actual deployment of fipronil at one of those baiting sites. These are just examples, but they're some of the work that we're doing. On the right-hand side, you can see a 3-kilometre grid. This is a baiting station grid. And on the left-hand side there, you can see one of the 10-kilometre circles where we have identified different places to place bait stations. And what the response is doing there is putting the baiting program in place and then monitoring the effectiveness of that baiting program in killing colonies at different locations in those circles. And another large part of that work is working with agencies like the EPA and the National Parks and Wildlife Service to find suitable locations to place these traps, so that work is going to have very minimal environmental impact, but a maximal impact on removing wild honeybee populations. So for more information, you can go to our DPI website, or you can simply Google New South Wales DPI Varroa mite and you'll get directed to that response webpage. Or if you like, you're quite welcome to send me an email, and my email address is as displayed on the screen. Thank you very much.